two stories. I don't know if I can trust him. Trust him not to start coming over all macho and aggressive like that again. The mediator summarises. So you agree with the idea of a calmer conversation. This is back to active listening, but hearing both stories. You agree with the idea of a calmer conversation. It's just that that way of talking, the aggression and the macho included, have made it harder for you to have any trust in him right now. Bernice nods cautiously. And Juan, you would prefer not to have that way of talking continue to rule your relationship and demand that you do its bidding. In fact, your personal preference is for calmer conversation. Have I got that right? Now let me speak a little bit about what's happened in this exchange and how it fits with the theme of externalizing conversation. At this point they both are agreeing, and they've both agreed with this final statement, and they've agreed with something for the third time in a row. So we've got three events in a possible story of reaching some agreement. They're small agreements, but they're still important. This exchange, of course, doesn't address all of the outstanding issues, and there's still a long way to go before they've re-established teamwork. But it begins the process, typical of narrative mediation, of inviting people to step out of a conflict story and to open and grow a counter-story. I just want to recap a little bit the elements of the shift and point out the mediator's purpose. Most of what the mediator says takes the form of questions. These questions are not so much about the content of the parties' stories, in this case, as about their relationship with those stories. Where we picked up the story was, however, after conversations about details of a problematic conflict, and from there things had deteriorated into name-calling and exchanges of blame, and the atmosphere had slipped into a shouting match, as they described it. From my perspective, there was little to be gained by encouraging the venting of strong emotions, which is sometimes advocated in mediation literature. I actually don't believe in the usefulness, therapeutic value, or communicative truthfulness of the cathartic release of emotion. If anything, the performance of angry blaming is likely to make it harder for Bernice and Juan to realise their hopes for better teamwork. The mediator's initial intervention here is a calculated attempt to invite them to step out of the argument. He does so by initiating an externalizing conversation, which involves giving the problem story a name. In this case, it is called, temporarily at least, that way of talking, which is not the name of either of the parties. It's a description of the situation between them. It includes both of them, by the way. This expression is used repeatedly by the mediator, and it's spoken of consistently as separate from the two parties. It is the problem, and they are constructed as the victim of its actions. If any blame is to be assigned, it is to that way of talking. It must wear it rather than Juan or Bernice. It has designs on them. It persuades them to its way of thinking. Sometimes it whispers convincing lies in their ears. It gets them to enact gendered behavioural patterns of macho aggression and female anxiety. And it interferes with sometimes with their better judgment. The linguistic shift involved, if sustained, starts to exert an effect on the grammar of the relationship between them, not just the grammar of the words. As typically happens in this instance, Bernice and Juan start to join with the externalizing form of language, almost without noticing it. This new way of speaking objectifies the problem and bundles up a number of exchanges under a nominalized heading. Linguistically, it lines up the parties alongside each other and in opposition to it. It's noticeable that Bernice and Juan have been arguing heatedly, but when the mediator starts using externalizing language, they actually agree on several things and start to talk in a different tone. Externalizing conversation, though, is more than, I think, a linguistic gimmick. It involves the enactment of a principle, one that's expressed in Michael White's aphorism for narrative practice: the person is not the problem is the problem. Aside from the effort to avoid non-productive blaming, The principle at stake here is the social constructionist one, that we are products of ways of speaking in conversation or discourse, rather than products of our essential nature. If we therefore change the way in which we speak, we potentially change our experience. Sometimes the externalized name for the problematic conflict just pops up in the conversation. Someone will exclaim, "This is just a mess." And the mediator can pick up on the word mess and inquire into how it is shaping the parties' relationship, rather than in their creation of the mess. So how is this mess taking over your better intentions? On other occasions, it's necessary to name it. The best strategy is then to ask the disputing parties to come up with a name. If we were to think of a name to describe this problem that we're up against, which seems to be causing you both so much pain, what might we call it? Can you suggest a name for this whole thing? Notice how this question positions people to respond. It, the third party, is constructed as the problem, rather than them, first or second party. They are positioned alongside each other as partners sharing in a joint struggle against it. The shift in positioning is subtle, but potentially makes for a significant difference in how two people who've been sharply at odds are now joined in relationship with the conflict. Where do we go next? Well, externalizing conversation needs to be capitalized upon and grown. And one of the easiest ways to grow that, and to ensure that that way of talking doesn't quickly return, is to engage in what we call mapping the effects. Mapping the effects of the conflict. This serves the purpose of creating further distance from the problem story that's been dogging their relationship. In the example above, the mediator asks the disputants to specify what it is doing to you both. When you ask this kind of question, people commonly respond in emotional terms. They would describe it as making them, as it being upsetting them, or making them angry or afraid of what the other person might say or do. Rather than treating these emotional expressions as goals of communication, to be recognised, as happens sometimes in some mediation practices, a narrative mediator treats them as entry points to a new story. Curiosity is what helps to grow the story. It soon leads to a story that's richer than a single emotional expression and contains actions and thoughts and feelings all working together. In an organisational dispute, the genre in which the effects of a conflict might be spoken about are quite different from a family conflict, obviously. For example, in Juan and Bernice's case, if we keep that inquiry going, we might hear how the workplace conflict has effects on people's ability to perform their job functions, rather than just their emotional experience. Or lowered staff morale might be noticed as the effect of a workplace dispute. Or customers drop off and profits are affected. Or colleagues come to dread meetings in which they're obliged to interact with each other. Or often people spend inordinate amounts of time thinking about a problem issue, especially conflict. We might say obsessing about it. I once did a mediation with two groups of nurses in which one person at this point said, "I've just realised I've been dreaming about this conflict every night." And he was outraged to notice, he hadn't actually put it together, but he at that moment noticed it and was quite outraged that this was happening. Mapping the effects of a conflict can also take account of the development of a narrative through time by inquiring into its past, present and future. We can ask about the effects in the past. What has this done to you? We can ask about the immediate present. How is it affecting you right at this minute in this room? And we can ask about the future with a question like, sorry, I should have shown that one a minute ago. No. Sorry, I haven't got the future one there. The future question is, it sounds like this mess is already, oh there it is, the second one. It sounds like this mess is already wreaking a fair bit of havoc for you both. But what if it were to continue unchecked? What if it were to get worse even? What would that be like, and how would you manage it? Mediation participants often shudder at the thought that things could get worse in the future, and as a result they are even more inclined to move. Here's some examples of other questions that can be asked that accomplish both the mapping of the effects of a conflict narrative and contrasting it with something else. Each of these questions already implies double listening. Has this conflict got you acting out of character? We've got the conflict story and we've got the character, whatever that might be. If so, what would be more in character for you? How has the tension led you to say things or do things against your better judgment? The saying or the do things is the conflict story, the better judgment is the counter story. Are there any intentions either of you has harboured to make things better that have been squashed by the interference of the struggle? If there is opportunity, the exploration of the effects of a conflict can go on for some time. Immediate effects often surface quite readily, but if we pursue the inquiry, less obvious but nonetheless important effects can be surfaced. The example I gave a minute ago about the dreaming was one of those. Many of these effects will have been scarcely noticeable before this point, but noticing them can have a salutary effect on people's motivation for change. The mediator needs to be patient and give time for less obvious effects to be surfaced, I think. At the same time, remain persistent in the inquiry. I have a favourite question that's very simple that I ask when I'm mapping the effects of a problem. What else? Very easy to remember. I can ask that. I can ask that in 5 different ways, actually. The message is the same. Reach a little further and think a little harder and see what emerges. Time taken to do this is often well spent. It leads us to the edge of commitment to a different relationship story. Massing all the effects of a conflict together is sometimes experienced as illuminating. People say things like this: it's quite ridiculous when I think about it. It's got to stop. We can't go on like this. Something's got to change. At which point I can then follow up with, so what would you prefer? And we're into the growth and development of a counter story. The final section I want to talk about is how to build those stories of cooperation. Because having entry points to them isn't quite enough. So again, let me start with a story. This one comes from a mediation between 2 sisters over disagreements about a will. And it comes after the beginning of a counter story, or the openings to a counter story, with the expression of people's readiness to move into it. Gina, can I ask you the same question I asked Brenda? You said you don't want these effects of the conflict to carry on, so what would you prefer? And she says, I would say validation of feelings. That's a big thing. So, a relationship in which feelings would validate it? She's clearly influenced by humanistic thinking. So what kind of relationship would do that? Asked the mediator, seeking a description of the relationship story. Well, I know she said that she's part of Joey's life, that's her son, which she is on occasion, but it would be nice if you, and she turns to her sister, would spend more time with our family. So it includes spending more time with your family. Anything else? Maybe not suggesting that my lifestyle is all that bad, as far as my choice of being a parent. Maybe tell me that I'm a good mom. Brenda and Gina are on the verge of generating a different relationship story. It's not the same thing as generating a different relationship. I want to be clear about that. Narrative mediation, however, works on the principle, the assumption, that shifting to a different story that governs the relationship leads to the details of the relationship itself starting to line up with the story that is governing that relationship. And I think it's the most efficient way of getting there. This story may be a story of cooperation, but it may take on a multitude of other possible names. Here I want to illustrate the process of generating a departure from the conflict story through growing Gina's story of validation. To this point, her description is a complaint about what's not there, rather than a recognition of much of a viable possibility in her relationship with her sister. But it's a unique outcome. A unique outcome in narrative practice is an instance, an event, an utterance, an intention even, of something that lies outside of a conflict story and doesn't fit with it. Often it lies neglected. It lies somewhere in the desert, without companions, starved of meaning, thirsty for recognition, and without attention it's going to die for lack of significance. On the other hand, a new story has to start somewhere. And a unique outcome, an exception, is a potential starting place for a different story. Mediator needs to hear the opening and grow it through asking questions so that it becomes a full-blown, well-formed story rather than an isolated moment. Isolated moments are too easily swamped. So we link it with other moments in order so that it remains not isolated and allocate meaning to them. In this way, a story starts to grow. Let me illustrate that. Gina says, I wish we could establish understanding. She wants me to validate her photography business. I want you to validate my parenting. Maybe we can better understand each other. Now, this is a nice abstract concept that she's expressing, but it doesn't have concrete expression yet. So I asked the question, tell me about the history of these things. The story is a line of force running through a relationship, so in order for it to be filled out, we can ask about its history. Have you had any places in the past where validation has happened? When I ask that question, this is the typical answer. Not that I can remember. It's not easy as a mediator to feel deflated at that moment. But I think it's important to hear not that there hasn't been such moments, but that the dominance of the conflict story blocks the visibility of any of the moments that could be seen. So what is required, I think, is persistence. So I ask, well, what would be the thing that would come closest to that? And she still can't see it. I have to get back to you on that, she says. Again, I think it's important not to give up. There has to be something that fits with the description that she gave. She can't have had that abstract idea without some experience that connects with it. So I asked the question in another way. I guess what I'm asking is, in the history of your relationship, has there been a single instance of something Brenda did that you experienced as validating? Now, for two people who have been sisters for much of their lives, they've got to have had some moment in their lives where they validated each other. I think that's a fair assumption. Therefore, I'll keep asking until I find it. The conflict simply is making that hard to notice at the moment. Gina comes up with, well, maybe when she does come over and visit our family, there's been a better spirit. A small concession. Okay, so there have been times when you had those visits that have felt like a better spirit. I'm using just simple active listening here to one of the stories. Yeah, she was able to have fun and it felt like everything fit perfectly. She makes meaning of the event in that statement. But I want to make it even more concrete. So I ask, are you thinking of a particular occasion as you say this? It was just like a Wednesday when we have taco night. She came over and just hung out and we watched television. Not a hugely powerful story in itself, except when we give it meaning. So I say, so it wasn't a big deal. It was just a Wednesday taco night watching television, but that felt neat to you somehow. It did. It felt like what we were supposed to do all along. That's a big statement of meaning. It, however, transpires that this event took place somewhat while ago, and therefore is less significant than it would be if it were more recent. She's reaching back about 2 or 3 years. So I keep on searching for other unique outcomes. Can I ask again? Are there any other little instances like that one that would fit with the greater understanding and validation between you? This time the answer comes more easily. I guess she did validate me when I took charge of the funeral arrangements. And there was a moment where we sat alone and before we talked about the will. We cried together and we were able to talk a lot about a lot of things. So it just felt like we were appreciative of each other. A moment from after the funeral where the two women were acting more like sisters, as they called it. Brenda is nodding and grunting her agreement at this moment. So I ask her, so for you, Brenda, this is a good principle for me. When I've got a unique outcome that's growing into a story, I'm going to turn to the other person and then ask them to make meaning of it. So for you, Brenda, was that a moment that was more like acting like sisters, which is the phrase she had used? Yeah. And you were able to have a family connection in that moment? Gina responds, she was very grateful, and I think she said how beautiful the funeral was and said thank you for taking over. So the story is a little bit bigger. What was that like for you, Brenda, that she did all the organising? She does a lot of those kinds of things, and I don't ever tell her that they're appreciated. So I do appreciate that she does that stuff and is like the glue of the family. I haven't ever said that before. I want to notice one thing in passing, by the way. One of the principles of active listening that's often talked about is use open questions, not closed questions. I think closed questions are really useful in certain circumstances. Here's an example. Was that more like acting like sisters? Yeah. That's easy to answer. It's rather than a closed question, I would call it a confirmation question. She's invited to confirm something that makes meaning connect between two things. One thing that she said and another thing that the other person has just spoken about. Then in this question here, the top one, it is expanded upon. And I think the sequence, especially when a story is very fragile, of asking a closed or a confirmation question followed by a more open one, is actually far more useful than saying don't ask closed questions. Just a comment in passing. Where are we? So Brenda voices her agreement. No, where was I? What was that like for you, Brenda, that she did all the organising? She does a lot of those kinds of things, and I don't ever tell her that they're appreciated. I read that piece. She's the glue of the family. I haven't ever said that before. Gina is quite moved by this statement from Brenda. Thank you, that was nice. The glue. That's sweet. What's it like to hear her say that? I ask. All along, says Gina, that's the kind of validation I wanted. This exchange between them is a unique outcome in the moment, in the room. That's not a conflict story at work, this is another story. It takes place in the immediate present, and there's a clear, different story of relationship that they can share, other than one that is dominated by the conflict. Now, the issues to do with the will are still outstanding, and they now need to be engaged. But what has been achieved to this point is the situating of both the parties in a relational story of understanding and validation, from which it is likely that they can negotiate much more productively the outcome of the will issues to do with the will. And that's where we went to next, which I'm not going to flesh out here. The conflict story has not gone away, but there is at least now a viable counter story. And the spirit of this counter story can now be invoked to aid them in sorting through what they need to negotiate. So I might ask a question. So in the spirit of validation and understanding, what ideas have you got now for resolving the questions in the will? How was the counter story accessed? Well, it began from an inquiry into what they're not happy with, proceeded with tracing the effects of what they're not happy with, then moved to what they would prefer, and gradually opened the story of a different kind of relationship, which they've been speaking about in this last sequence. Plot events have been found in that story. Thematic elements have been identified. Different characterizations have been elaborated. The story has been fleshed out far enough to be recognized by the parties as what they value. So just to finish, I want to just summarize the kind of points that I've been making this afternoon. Double listening is a foundational practice, I believe, in narrative mediation. It's founded on a process of differentiation rather than integration. It values complexity ahead of linear certitude. Treats the existence of multiple narratives as a rich resource rather than as a complication to be simplified away. Encourages mediators to listen for points of bifurcation in the middle of a narrative, or even in the middle of a sentence. It hears intense emotional expressions as potentially giving away to subtle distinctions, if we turn the coin over and look at the other side. To notice that there are two or more possible stories allows people to make shifts from one to the other. Understanding this principle is often experienced as introducing a tone of lightness into a tense situation. That's often what people sometimes experience. It doesn't necessarily involve seeing the silver lining or accentuating the positive or jollying people along. It's different from that. Just noticing the alternative narrative and inviting people to establish a preference is enough. Often enough, anyway. You don't even have to give up on the conflict. And this narrative that... Thank you. You don't even have to give up on the conflict. It just needs to notice that there's another option. In this sense, I think that double listening represents an advance on the well-known practice of active listening, which often carries with it the danger of locking people into a single story. If you haven't seen it, by the way, there's a wonderful video on YouTube called The Danger of the Single Story. Has anyone seen that? I really recommend it. It's a wonderful 15-minute TED Talk. You know the TED Talks? By a Nigerian novelist called called Chimamanda Adichie. But just look up The Danger of a Single Story. It's a wonderful piece of conflict resolution. People interested in conflict resolution should, I think, pay attention to it. It's a fantastic piece of video, and she talks very eloquently about the danger of a single story. This new use is defined by a difference in what we listen for, rather than just how we might listen. And conflict stories often feature blame and objectification of the other. Pretty easy to see that happening. It's reversed by using externalizing conversation so that the problem is objectified and blamed rather than the person. But when we're talking about externalizing, I think it's important to notice that this is more than a linguistic gimmick. It's actually a practice that involves putting the problem back into the discourse rather than having it exist in the heart of people. It's continued by mapping the effects of a problem once it's been externalized. And final couple of comments. It's more productive, I believe, to explore the effects of a conflict than to ask about the causes of it. The conflict is a narrative running through. We can't ever find a line of force running through experience. We can't ever find where the origin was because it's way back before the start of the relationship. But it's useful to trace what the effects of it are once it's started. Effects, of course, can be altered. They can be altered by just making a 1% bend in the direction of a conflict sometimes. If you change the direction of someone's experience 1%, in 30 years they're a different person. And when we do change the line of direction of a conflict, and notice the effects of it, often it increases people's motivation to embrace a conflict story, and as we move further to develop it, it can grow a totally different experience of relationship. So, I just wanted to outline a few of the things which I've been thinking about and wanting to emphasize as practices in the midst of listening to a conflict story and the narratives that shape it and the narratives that give us a pathway out of them, and to represent a few practices that are about growing that counter story once we've heard it. Thanks very much for your attention.